What is up, guys? Welcome to the week one cash game review. This is our first DFS MVP cash game review. We're going to be doing this every Monday at this time. I am your host, TJ Hernandez, with your co host, Matt Savoca. Matt,
What's going on?
how'd week one treat you?
Oh my gosh, man. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm
Yeah.
not thrilled to talk about my lineups. There were some wins and some losses in
Hmm.
DFS. And I will say I last year I played primarily DraftKings cash games and doing the FanDuel cash game review and lineup, I figured I'd switch a majority of my cash game play over to FanDuel
Yeah,
this year. And we'll talk about it a little bit later, but there's a learning curve and
for sure.
certainly things I didn't know going into week one that I would have changed now.
Yeah, well, let's actually before we get into the hits and misses and whatnot, like how do you feel in general about mixing up your cash games between sites? Like, obviously you're probably still playing on on DraftKings. Like, do you have a strong lean if you're somebody that is new and you don't have a sample size of how you should be mixing it up?
Yeah, I really think you should stick to one and learn one first because, and I think we
Hmm.
said this in a previous DFS MVP podcast. Each slate is so different and the
Yeah.
value propositions for each player are so different. To learn two slates at once, I think is really tough. Even if we're talking cash games, optimal lineups, it's really tough.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I like people like us who got into DFS early. I think we probably had the benefit of ignorance, where we were kind of just throwing money everywhere we could, and lucky enough to like get a pretty big sample size of games by the time we started being serious or trying to be as serious as we are now about this. So if you are somebody like that, I think it's as simple as going over your results, even if it's just from last year, seeing where you did better. I was somebody that was for the longest time I was trying to play 50-50 because it was kind of just like a lower the variance type thing, if I do bad on one and not on the other, that'll be fine. But I was just winning more on DraftKings, so I was like, I need to play less on FanDuel. So I'm still playing both. I still just do like the difference in the thought, difference in formats, and I'm playing a lot of the single entry tournaments we've talked about on FanDuel. It just gives me an idea of like how the slate feels and what people like. Because one thing that I think is beneficial, even if you're like don't play cash games, the most popular cash game builds, that's going to bleed over into tournaments a lot. Like whatever's working value wise, like we're going to see those structures a lot, right? So there's some benefit to at least knowing. But yeah, I agree with you. I think probably in retrospect, as if I was a brand new player, I'd probably be I probably would have wished I had somebody that said find one that you like better and just really stick to that. Now, if that is a month into the season, 6 weeks into the season, it's hard to get it's hard to get a big sample. But I agree with that. So let's jump into FanDuel. Let's take a look at your lineup, Sal. Throw that up on the screen for us, and then I mean, not and let's look at this every week. Like we're gonna have our hits and misses, right? So we're not necessarily trying to look at like if we won or not, but like what can we take away, and then what the field was doing that we didn't do. And week one is we talked about it all week. We talked about it on the podcast. We talked about it in our articles. Week one is just a really it's a high variant slate, right? So like your process was pretty much on board with people that won, but let's start with what worked for you. What hit that you were happy about?
Well, I mean, looking at this lineup, what did hit? But
Hmm.
one thing we should mention too is that the cash line in these week one double ups was really low. I think I
Yeah,
saw a 98 in one of
yeah,
them,
yeah,
99. So 90 points is like jarringly low, and it
yeah,
certainly didn't feel great to finish Sunday night there. But there are some things we can definitely take away from it. First of all, Devonta Smith, he's a stud.
yeah,
Whatever else is going on in the Philadelphia offense, we completely nailed the fact that Devonta Smith could be really benefiting from a huge amount of targets right off the bat. And I think he had 50% plus of the air yards in Philadelphia. So
wow,
that
yeah,
just player eval was right on. Now, Christian McCaffrey, could you say he was a correct pick? Well, in the sense that he produced more than Dalvin Cook and he produced more than Alvin Kamara and he certainly produced more than Derrick Henry. Sure. But ultimately, we identified some of the value running back plays. We even talked about one for a while in Nick Chubb. And moving down to that mid tier running back really opened up the rest of your roster, particularly at the wide receiver position. It let you move out of the stud wide receiver and low salary wide receiver combination and get into the more mid tier. And we saw a ton of these mid tier receivers that people have been talking up all week hit just fine.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the Christian McCaffrey more. He was priced up way more on FanDuel, and I think on FanDuel, a lot of the times you're still going to justify him as a play because he's still going to he's still liable to rack up 150 total yards no matter what. You still do get some points for touches. So 150 yards and 6-7 catches, you're still getting your 20 DraftKings or FanDuel points. And then if he scores, he's a fine play. I think last week it was just he was priced up a little too much in retrospect with what did end up hitting. So before we get into the idea of the builds that worked and where it did hit, I mean, I wouldn't say that your point totals are misses because Elijah Moore, Kyle Pitts, James Robinson, I mean, I think those are plays. Josh Allen, obviously, those are plays that you play those because you're not taking when they do bottom out, you're right there with the field, right? So we kind of knew that was going to happen. So when we talk about your misses, what stands out to you that you might have overlooked or that you're just not super happy with yourself on?
I think I had the concerns about James Robinson, and they came completely true. I think we talked about it even briefly on Friday's podcast about the possibility of Carlos Hyde being used. And this was a terrible game script. Talk about a game that really turned on its head and went the opposite direction that the Vegas total implied. I mean, we figured if Carlos Hyde was going to be anything, he was going to be a goal line back. But then they got down multiple scores, and James Robinson is barely involved in the offense whatsoever. Now, part of that is because Trevor Lawrence was taking shots, and he was going downfield, and his wide receivers got a huge amount of targets. I think DJ Chark had over a dozen targets. I think maybe 14. And so, I mean, that's great for the offense, big playability. But for James Robinson in cash, I don't think you'll see the lineup anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, I luckily I didn't land on Robinson in cash. I used him a ton in Yahoo tournaments just because he worked there really well. So obviously those lineups didn't do great. I mean, I think again going back to week one and what we thought we knew. I was so focused, and I think a lot of people might have been of the similar thought. I was so focused on how bad Houston was and how bad we thought they were going to be that we forgot that Jacksonville was the worst team in the league last year. And they're still starting new. And it was easy, Trevor Lawrence and these wide receivers. And yeah, I'm excited about Darrell Bevel, and I do think there's going to be a ton of juice in this passing game to be had, probably more so for tournaments. But I just I missed there pretty hard too. Talk a little bit about Devontae, because I mean that's a play where, especially on DraftKings, I was really thinking about trying to get to him. Obviously, the Packers were just a complete whiff across the board. But what was your thought process of getting up to not just Devontae, but to a high-priced receiver this week? And what the hell is up with the Packers, man?
I mean, yeah, from a real football sense, we could have a long conversation about what the heck just happened there. And I also want to mention, as a caveat, I think what happened in Packers Saints is such a great way to think about cash versus tournament building, because this is a perfect example of everyone, including myself, having an opinion about how this game flow was going to play out. We knew the defensive line was strong for New Orleans, so Aaron Jones had a tough matchup, and the secondary was banged up. We didn't even know if Marshawn Lattimore was gonna play, let alone be close to 100%. Therefore, Devontae Adams in a winning game script for the Packers. In a tournament, this was such a great time to say, well, I do know Jameis Winston when he succeeds, he often succeeds big. And no one is going to be on that scenario because they're playing the Packers. And so in cash, of course, I'm going with the highest probability outcome, which is what I believe with Devontae Adams having the highest probability of 12 or more targets. And on FanDuel, where touchdowns are so important, Devontae Adams' red zone role on a week-to-week basis is so much higher than every other wide
Yeah.
receiver, especially on this platform. If I'm going to move up into that premium tier, I want Devontae Adams in what I consider to be a strong matchup. And when the rest of the industry started to flow that way, then I felt confident in my decision. What's funny is when the Trace Sermon news went live, I started tinkering with this lineup that moved Devontae Adams out, and
Mhm.
as it put Laviska Shenault in and Jalen Hurts in and Raheem Mostert in, and that lineup scored a whole lot more. But it's funny how the anchoring of CMC and Devontae Adams really
Mhm.
was the whole basis of my lineup this week.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good word, anchoring. We get so caught up, like when we do these early builds, or we are people that make content, we fall in love with these guys early, and that's what we kind of build around, right? I actually forgot to bring this up, and I was going to forget to talk about this, but when the sermon news dropped, I mean, what did your morning look like? How were you adjusting? We don't even have to stick to cash games here. Just like what was your just thought process with Mostert? Yes, when everything happened yesterday.
My thought was, of course, he's going to be chalk now.
Hmm.
And it's funny, I was on a live show, so I couldn't do much
Yeah,
in
me
terms of
me
changing
too.
my lineups at the time. So the first priority was, of course, getting Trey Sermon out of any sort of tournament lineup.
Hmm.
And what's funny is I had a thought that maybe you should just leave the lineup as is and just switch to the next 49ers running back up. But in general, my thought process was, wow, this play that looks pretty good on paper, but has a low probability of hitting what I considered a slate breaking ceiling simply because the touch share, you knew it was always going to be a share a committee in San
Hmm.
Francisco. I don't think Raheem Mostert's had more than 17 carries in a game.
Right.
So it's one of those situations where now you have a play that has a decent probability of hitting that everybody is on. In tournaments, I'm probably looking elsewhere, period.
Yeah.
But in cash, the way I said it as on the live stream is I definitely don't mind going there. You certainly don't have to.
Yeah, I am, and we'll get to DraftKings in a moment, but I actually, my immediate reaction was like, get Mostert into my cash lineup, and then start seeing what I could do with the high dollar pass catchers. Once I did that, I kind of stepped back and I was like, first of all, I don't know if Mostert's going to catch that many balls, even if he does have a good game, which is obviously really important on DraftKings. And like you said, like even if it is his backfield, they always have other running backs involved. uh I undershot, and again, this is a GPP thought. I undershot like what his ownership was going to be, because we saw something similar with Tony Pollard last year, and I made this huge Twitter thread about like people are just suck at reacting to news. We did get that like 90 minutes before kickoff instead of like 20, so I guess I guess that was the big difference there in terms of
Mm-hmm.
him ended up being super chalky. And then obviously if he doesn't get hurt, like he probably does go for 20 FanDuel points or something. Let's kind of zoom out a little bit and take like a macro look, not just at the players, but um, looking at like what happened. Obviously, I'm not going to say like what players would you have picked specifically, but
Sure.
like from a build perspective, what would you have liked to change on FanDuel this week?
Yeah, I think Josh Allen felt like the cheapest salary quarterback where the upside of being the number one quarterback falls off a cliff after the Allen
Yeah.
tier. So I felt like I was getting a huge floor that didn't really exist. And if there's one thing I would change from a construction standpoint is have some willingness, not necessarily to go to the bottom tier for quarterbacks, but to go to that middle tier because we
Yeah.
really did do a good job of identifying who was in strong situations this weekend. Yes, a couple of them were wrong, Ryan Tannehill, but everyone was talking about Jalen Hurts. Everyone was talking about Kyler Murray.
Mhm.
And if I'm paying up, I think in a situation where the the Chiefs are in a good game script as we suspected, if I'm paying up, I got to find a way to get to Mahomes. And
Yeah.
then there is sort of that anchoring we talked about where it felt so much more comfortable to have Christian McCaffrey rather than the second tier running backs that I could have gotten multiple of that we knew were going to have 80% plus of their backfield touches, a player like Joe Mixon. Um, And Najee Harris actually fits that description, but we knew
Yeah.
the negatives, the downsides for him. So I'm actually least upset about Najee Harris's points because the workload was completely there. But I really think I should have structured my lineup in a way that let me have more flexibility with my mid-tier receivers. Because the truth is, I knew that Corey Davis was a stronger play than Elijah Moore in the same game environment. But because of the anchoring of those top tier players, I was too focused on that and couldn't figure out a way to fit him in.
Yeah, you talked about like where you could have gotten like what worked in winning lineups was a lot of lineups were basically lineups that faded CMC and then I think pretty much had like some combo of like Kyler and Tyreek or Mahomes. I think it was I think there's probably more Mahomes Kelsey in cash than like and Kyler Tyreek if I remember how those builds worked, but what was your take on Tyreek on FanDuel? Because he's a player that I said like this is a Tyreek week, even in cash on DraftKings, even more so on FanDuel, just because touchdowns are so important. Like, where were you at on Tyreek versus Kelsey? Or I mean, you said you wish you would have had that game in general, but where were you at on Reek in general last week, or I guess yesterday?
Yeah, I was on him in tournaments, but I was not on him in cash games. I just
Mm-hmm.
thought it was too volatile. I knew the volatility could be very, very good, but if I was going Chiefs, I was going Chiefs stack and I was doing Mahomes Kelsey.
Sure.
Hey, I'm looking at the not that it matters in this giant double up with where the top 17,500 win, the very top score stacked Mahomes, Kelsey, Hill. And you know what? It's sort of like the conversation we had a few weeks ago about single entry tournaments. If you do Mahomes, Kelsey, Hill, even in cash, you probably are in a positive game environment for them, which let's be real, what isn't a positive game environment for the Chiefs? You're probably getting two big scores out of
Sure.
that. So you don't need everything to go right. Now, of course, it's a little flimsy, but it certainly can work.
Yeah. When
And
we
I'm seeing
get
some of these top scores. Yeah. Sorry, they had tons of premium wide receivers,
mhm.
and some of them even failed, like Tyreek Hill and Stephon Diggs. Diggs that did not have a great week, but they're still cashing.
Yeah, when we kind of get to the end where we kind of give our broad overview, like I have some thoughts about like looking at the top scores. A lot of times those are like the outlier scores, not necessarily the best cash
Totally.
game builds, but there are but I do have some thoughts about that. Any last thoughts on FanDuel before we move on over to DraftKings?
Don't get discouraged about a bad week one
Yeah.
score.
Yeah, for sure. Before we move on to DraftKings, anybody that's viewing or listening right now, if we do have time at the end every week, we will answer some of your general like review questions. So throw them up if you want. No pressure if you're not interested. But let's move on over to DraftKings. I had a pretty good week on DraftKings. Like you mentioned, we didn't need a super high score to be successful this week. That's what happens when the way things were set up. Like people were paying all the way down at wide receiver, and luckily I was like right around 80% winning in head to heads. Cashed my big double up and had a nice ROI. That's always not going to happen. It's a really, really good week in head to heads. And before I get into the hits and misses, one thing that I do with my cash games, and we've talked about a little bit, mixing in like upsides. So like I like to throw this into like a 3x, a couple 10x's, and then a winner take all. Did you do that this week with any of your lineups? I know we talked about it, but like what was your approach to building upside into your cash game lineups this week?
I usually do, and I did enter my cash game lineup in the cheap Millie Maker, but it was really a time constraint thing that I just didn't get to it that much this weekend.
Yeah, definitely. On DraftKings, they have these really cool. They're just a 100 man. I play the $9 one, but there's $5 ones. Winner take all. So I mean, you could basically like 50 extra money with your cash game lineup, which I think is nice. And trying to beat 100 people instead of like hoping it comes in top 1% of like a 2,000 man contest or something is pretty fun. Hits. You talked about Jalen a little bit over on FanDuel. For me, my anchoring was like I wanted to lock in Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook. And then I put out a poll on Twitter on, I think it was Friday or Saturday night, and I wasn't trying to like be funny or throw names out there. I was being dead serious. Like, who has a better chance of a double bonus on DraftKings, Christian McCaffrey or Jalen Hurts? And that never happens. I think we had one from Lamar in the playoffs, one from Christian McCaffrey like 3 years ago, and I think one from Austin Eckler that same 2 years ago, maybe. But I was just looking at these game environments and looking at what Jalen did. Obviously, CMC can always go for 100, and I think he missed the rushing bonus by 2 and the receiving bonus by 11. And then Jalen went for, I think he went for like 278 and like 80 or something like that, or 70. Oh, it says right there, 60, 67. So this was a build where I got on Alvin Kamara late. And again, I want to hear your thoughts on how you approach these things, because we do our content and we explain how we want to build these lineups. We have this early idea of how we want to build these lineups. And then Saturday night at midnight, I'm building, and I just kind of have an epiphany. Like, I didn't write up Kamara, but if I go down to Jalen, now I could fit Kamara with these other 2 running backs. So even though in a vacuum I liked him less than McCaffrey and Cook, when I realize it fits, I go to the article, add a little caveat that I'm using him only if I can fit him here, and then go to Discord and tell them that. And so that's why I think it is important for our users to get in the Discord, to like be accessing us, so we have that thought process. Because when we're writing our content and thinking about how things work, even if we do go in and do a build, when you actually start making your lineups, these things happen. And once you start doing the build, things flip. So like, did you have anything like that this week, or do you have that like every week where you write your content, you have your idea, and then when it comes to the Sunday morning build, all of a sudden you're rostering a tight end because he fits, even though you never wrote him up or never thought about him? You're like, I'm just going to punt this tight end and he makes everything else work.
I like to think that this is getting better, but this was definitely a leak in my game from Saturday night to Sunday morning. The whole slate felt like it was washing over me anew, and that's one of my points of emphasis to improve as a player. And one thing I really identified was, I don't know if you want to I called it optimizer syndrome. Once you get into the optimizer, it starts spitting out these players that you spent a whole week of researching, sort of it's either confirming your priors or it's telling you something new. And what you do with that information is almost more important than all the new Schefter tweets or the news info coming in. I still feel like the best thing you can do to fix that is actually just have a strong process from Monday to Friday that you can lean back on. And when push comes to shove and you're inundated with new information, you have a set way of going about answering your questions, or a set of statistics that you can say, okay, here's how I break the tie, no matter what the projections are saying.
For sure. Yeah, I think it was just like that. It was one of those situations where early in the season and in week 1, like I don't remember if I mentioned it on our pod or if it was on if it was on the Yahoo pod, but paying up for things that we're way more certain about early on, I'm going to be more willing to do. So even though I wasn't initially on Kamara, it just made more sense to get him in there and have a third reliable running back. And I didn't write up Kyle Pitts either, but when I was on the rest of these plays together, it just kind of fit. Now that leads into Kyle Pitts didn't hit, the Falcons didn't hit, Elijah Moore didn't hit, Marquez Callaway didn't hit. In my article, even before the Kamara take, I said it was important to get to these on DraftKings, especially these pass catching running backs and these dual threat quarterbacks, because their floor and ceiling is more than going to make up for. I specifically wrote Elijah Moore, Marquez Callaway, Rondale Moore, and I think Terrace Marshall was the other one popping. All their floors are 0, and I'm very aware of that, but these other players were more than make up for their floors. So even like in our winning weeks, when we're talking about reviewing, it's not like reviewing how could I have made the perfect lineup. Like, was the process sound? And I think the process was sound, that like I was pretty aware that I was going to have some pretty big misses just because we're paying for 4 min-price players in a lineup. That's like this.
That's the tier we're in, right?
Right, yeah. So you want to be able to account for that. I think, and did you see this in FanDuel? I noticed that there were a ton of duplicated lineups on DraftKings, and I don't think that has anything to do with collusion. I don't think there's someone selling lineups. I think so many people fell on this like cheap wide receiver running back build that there was only so many ways you could go.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Also, when you have the uniqueness of this slate was the availability of all of the premium tier running backs. They were
Mm-hmm.
all available, plus Devontae Adams, plus Stephon Diggs, plus DeAndre Hopkins. So just the fact that you had all of them, where we're going to get into a few weeks where it feels like there's only one premium option, that just
Yeah.
wasn't the case here. So, I think there are different takeaways every week, but the bottom line is like we're just trying to build out floor in the best way possible, and there's only one set of fantasy football assets that do that in the best way, and that's the very top running backs and the rushing quarterbacks. And so from there we can make other mistakes, and sometimes they're going to be big, especially week 1.
Yeah. I think that obviously I had a good week, and I think the process worked this week. Even though I won, one piece of advice that I completely forgot to take myself or to give listeners or subscribers, usually in weeks like this where it's either super high variance, like we don't know a lot in week 1, or when salaries are super loose, I usually like to dial back my cash game a lot. So if I'm someone that plays like 80-20, dial it back to like, I don't know, 70-30, or even like 50-50 if you are really open to taking on more risk. But there's just more variance in cash games, and there's more money in GPPs, and probably more dead money in week 1 in GPPs. So when I don't know when it's just one of those weeks where a lot can go wrong. And I mean, look, if I stay on Josh Allen and end up with, I don't know, whoever else my lineup, James Robinson, I have a very different week, right? So it's that fragile. Even
Hey,
though
if I
I
could
had
add one more thing to that, and this answers your question a little bit better about the duplicated lineups and was there collusion? No, there wasn't collusion. It's about we had the same set of unknowns that we were working with. Now, once we get into the first few weeks of the season, and the people who are using machine learning to create projections, they're going to be finding the same conclusions. But what the projections didn't show was pretty much the same across the industry. So it's one of those things where the clear value plays coalesced around the same people on every single website, no matter what you looked at. And then the only ways to fit, they basically rise to the top because you're trying to fit in those same premium assets. Now, it was exciting because we had a couple of premium assets to choose from, but in general, we're all building the lineups the same way.
Yeah, and when we get to these bye weeks and we have a week where CMC is on the only premium running back and people are jamming, like it's gonna, like we're only gonna see that like compound in certain weeks or certain availabilities. So if you're new to DFS, don't be surprised by that. Don't be scared by that. It's how it works. Like you said, yeah, a lot of these values were obvious. Every week we're just going to kind of do a quick just rundown of what happened during the week, if anything stands out or not. Obviously, we're still doing this before the Monday night game even happened, but just like kind of a broad, not even DFS. It could be DFS, could be fantasy, could be just real football. What really surprised you this week?
Well, I mean, there was a whole lot of surprises. Didn't all but 3 of the favorites lose against the spread or lose outright? Just a ton of misses in terms of Vegas lines, which will obviously get better as the season goes on. I touched on some of the big ones. The usage of the running backs in Jacksonville, the answer might be no one. The fact that the Texans, at least when they're playing the Jaguars, have some sort of usable offense, and Brandon Cooks looks like he's going to be fed as he has many a year before. And I think the biggest thing that we haven't mentioned is the Titans-Cardinals game being a great game environment to build around, just as long as you were using Cardinals, because there were plenty of points, but none of them from that hopefully consolidated Tennessee side that I certainly had some tournament lineups that went the dumpster for.
Yeah, that's a team that I mean, as efficient as they've been in a passing game, and obviously they have Julio now, so it changes it a little bit if Julio can be like 80% of Julio, but like never a team that was really built to play from behind. Obviously, we're not going to hit the panic button on them yet, but two of the biggest departures there, Arthur Smith, who was obviously calling their plays, and then Jonnu Smith, who did a ton of for their offense. I think there's a chance that there's a lot more of that to come from the Titans. I'm not saying I'm just like off of them, but there were like some real concerns with their offensive line, and their play calling was just atrocious. Once Big Dog couldn't get it going, like it felt like they were just panicking right away. So I'm really interested
And
to
they
see
had
how
no time
how
to throw.
no time to throw. Their offensive line was awful. Obviously, Josh Allen was like the one that really stood out for me. He did not play a good game. I mean, Jordan Vanek kind of warned us about that. Pittsburgh does have a good front, and it was week one. I mean, I think I didn't see anything that I would think that's gonna be a bad offense. I mean, I think they're still gonna be fine. Do you have any leans or worries about the Bills besides like just obviously they played bad?
Yeah, some of the football analytics, the smarts out there are talking about how they didn't use as much play action and they used more 4 wide receiver sets in general. That's not plus EV play calling. We'll see if that's just a 1 week sample size to try to spread out a Pittsburgh defense that we knew was going to be formidable, and they showed why on Sunday. I think that spread was the easiest one to be like, this isn't right.
Yeah, and they were getting behind Steelers secondary. Like Josh just missed on a couple passes, and those are hard passes to hit. If he hits on one or even two of those, all of a sudden they're up by 14 or 17, and we're talking about a way different game. So I think those are going to be fine. From a DFS perspective, anything process wise that you're changing going into this week?
I'm not completely changing my process. I'm just reminding myself that the tiers of salary and wide receiver really, really matter. We talked about the reasons we can use low tier wide receivers to help us get up to premium tier players, but the mid tier of the wide receiver still provides us a significantly higher floor. We saw a ton of these mid tier players hit, and some of them hit big. Like let's talk about Tyler Lockett's big day. Metcalf hit as well. I guess he's premium tier or closer to it, but we had some mega days from mid tier receivers that we've been talking about all week in game environments that we didn't expect. For instance, that Jacksonville game, there were more passes because they were playing from behind. And now it looks like the Jaguars, which we do assume are going to be playing from behind, are going to be throwing a ton. And we might be able to utilize 2 or at least multiple of these wide receivers in the same week. That's exciting.
Yeah, the structures just in general of how we're building are going to change every single week, right? So I think just because people saw this high low or studs and duds build work, they shouldn't just assume that's how you win in cash. So definitely that, and just in general, I think going into week 2, don't overreact to your results. Don't overreact to like one game. Like I said, the Titans, we might be worried about. The Packers, we might be worried about. The Bills, but also it's a 1 game sample. The teams that did really good, don't assume they're going to continue to be good. I think the most important thing we can do is just follow the processes, follow the touches, follow volume. We're going to talk about that probably a ton in this week's DFS MVP. And when you're reviewing, like you said, just because a team lost doesn't mean it was a bad build, and just because they won, like where I was talking about earlier, if you look at the top of the leaderboard, I mean, there's a lot of times that like in a big double up, those are the outlier scores, right? It's people that were like I saw some like cash lineups with like Chase Edmonds or like Brandon Cooks or something, and like you can make the argument for how they could be good plays, but those just aren't the types of plays that we're looking for in cash. But I'm excited about doing this every week. One, it's just going to keep me accountable and keep me on my toes. And, everybody's going to be looking at what you're doing. It just makes you, that much more. You want to do good that much more. And it's a good process to review. Everybody should be reviewing. Any last thoughts before we jump out of here?
Yeah, I'm kind of glad that we got a bad score out of the way week 1 because I was dreading it, and now it's smooth sailing from week 2 on.
Yeah, it's like your first bomb in comedy. Once it's over with, you can do it. It gets easier and easier every time. Thanks for checking it out, everybody. We're going to be doing this every week at the same time. If you enjoyed it, please like us on YouTube. That helps a ton, and follow 4for4 We have a bunch of other DFS shows every single week. The DFS MVP with Matt and myself streams 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time on Fridays. That's here on YouTube, of course, on all the major audio podcast platforms. Matt Harmon and I do a Yahoo DFS audio-only podcast that releases every Saturday on all major platforms, both on DFS MVP feed and on the Yahoo Fantasy feed. And then the GPP Last Look show that is on Discord, subscriber only. So make sure you sign up for 4 for 4 in Discord. The links are in the description. That's with Jordan Vanek at 8 a.m. Pacific time, 11 a.m. Eastern time on Sunday mornings. And then follow us all on Twitter. 4 for 4 at 4 for 4 football. Matt at Draftaholic. I'm at TJ Hernandez. We will talk to you guys next week.